Now, to begin with, how does deaf culture differ from hearing culture?
Okay. One thing that's different in deaf culture is the use of touch. Another is the use of eye contact. Also using the index finger to point. Sometimes in the non-deaf world, touch is considered impolite. Eye contact as well can be considered rude. And pointing at a person using the index finger is also sometimes considered impolite. Within the deaf community, all of these are strategies that are used for communication and are not considered impolite. So for instance, if I need to get someone's attention, if I were to say, Amanda, the way I would do that in ASL is to touch Amanda on her shoulder. Eye contact is also a very important part of communication in the deaf community. It's a way of making sure that we're on the same page, that we're communicating with each other. And using the finger to point in American Sign Language actually has many different purposes. It's a pronoun. It indicates he, she, this, that, there. So it has several grammatical uses. It's used when giving directions to a particular locale. And sometimes people think it's impolite if they see a deaf person pointing or pointing at them, but it's actually an integral part of the language. The term hearing impaired is another example of something that's viewed differently by deaf and non-deaf people. The deaf community does not like the word hearing impaired because it has a strong medical or pathological flavor, whereas the deaf community refer to ourselves as deaf or as hard of hearing. Those are the preferred terms within the community, or late deafened for people who lose their hearing later in life.
And how does learning differ in schools for the deaf versus mainstream schools?
For example, for students who are being taught in the mainstream, very often they're being taught by in schools for the deaf, typically students are being taught by a teacher who shares their language and can communicate with them directly. The teacher is using sign language and the student is reading sign language. Students are generally placed in a semicircle position so that everybody can see every other person in the class and the students are able to clue into who's speaking at any given time. In a mainstream setting, however, students usually sit in rows facing the front of the room. And I'm talking here about mainstreamed with one student, one deaf student, in a completely typical public school classroom, which is not always the case. But if a student is the lone deaf student in a classroom, sometimes not only can't they see the other students, they may have their back turned, they may be facing off in a different direction to look at the interpreter, and they may not have the same visual access to the classroom that they would in a different environment. Typically, an interpreter doesn't necessarily sit right next to the teacher, and it may be difficult for the student to be visually attending to an interpreter and a teacher and the blackboard all at the same time. In a deaf school environment, the teacher is signing to the students and then pausing to turn around and write on the board so that the students are able to take in each piece of visual information discreetly, rather than trying to do more than one thing at the same time. There are different norms in those environments as well in terms of ability to work with role models. Typically faculty and staff and dorm parents in deaf schools are themselves deaf or users of American Sign Language. In the mainstream setting, there may be somebody else who uses the language in the school. It may be only the interpreter. In certain settings in the mainstream, there are teachers who do use sign language directly with the students, but that's not always the case. Typically, in a deaf classroom, in a deaf school, students are able to share commonalities and common experiences they have as deaf people in a world that's not always sensitive to deaf people's needs. Students in the mainstream may feel somewhat isolated as the lone person who has this very particular, distinct set of experiences that are different from the peers in that class. So it can be somewhat isolating. Again, I'm referring here to mainstream classes where the deaf student is the only child in the program who is deaf, as opposed to self-contained classrooms where there may be several deaf students being served.